Let's start having some real fun. So we've already talked about how we're going to be using Redis. Now, what I want to do is create a couple of unit tests that are going to help us drive out the functionality that we want to have in our learning management system. So we want a user to be able to complete a lesson. We also want a user to be able to complete a series, and we want to store the track record of the series that the user has completed, the number of lessons completed by the user, and all of that. So we're going to be using unit tests because we want to test specific methods on the user class that store the records of progress for a particular user. So I'll start by creating a unit test, php artisan make test, and I'll call this user test, and I'll specify that it's unit. So every single test that we want to test that concerns the user class, we're going to put it in this user test. Okay, so the first test I'm running is test a user can complete a lesson. Okay, so what does this test really mean? I want to have a user in my system, and I want this user to click on the start series button, which is going to take him to the page where he can watch the episodes or lessons in this series. And once he finishes to watch a lesson, it should automatically save the ID of the lesson in the Redis database to tell us that this user has already watched this lesson. Okay, so maybe we're gonna have a key like user, and then we'll pass in the user's ID, and then we're gonna have series for the particular series ID, and then we're gonna map this to an array that stores the IDs of all the lessons that the user has watched in this particular series. Okay, so for our arrange step, we'll have user, we'll create a new user, we'll create a new series, then we'll perform an action, and we might call a complete lesson method on our user, and finally we can make some assertions. We can assert that our Redis database has a key user with the ID of the user, then the ID of the series, and then assert that it actually has an array that contains the ID of that lesson that the user completed. Okay, so let's try this out. We'll start by creating our user. User equals factory, create, and we're going to specify that we want for the user class. So we'll create a series also, and we'll specify the series class. And if we want to complete a lesson, we need to also create a lesson. So we'll say lesson factory, and we'll say for the lesson class, and we'll create. And for testing purposes, let's make sure that this lesson actually belongs to this series by overwriting the series ID field from our factory and making sure that it puts in our own ID, which will be the series that we just created right here. Okay, then we would call our user complete lesson method, and for our assertion, we would say this assert equals Redis, and we'll use as members because we want to save it in a set. Remember, we're using a set because we don't want duplicate values. It's just like a list, but it's not going to allow us to store duplicate values into that list or array. Okay, so we want to assert that when we call Redis to get a key, which is user, and the ID of that user should be 1, and the series ID should be 1, this exact key should match an array which has ID 1. Okay, so when we complete lesson 1, it should create this key, which is for the series that this lesson belongs to, and we've already specified that it belongs to series 1, because remember, we're going to be using a fresh database, right? So this user will be ID of 1, series ID of 1, lesson ID of 1 also, and we are trying to make sure that this key would exist in a Redis store, and it would automatically be equal to the Redis ID of 1. Okay, now before we run this test, I'll do a little quick of imports. One for podcast, user, for the lesson, and the series. Okay, let's run this test individually. Run it. We have a failure. Call to undefined method complete lesson. So I'll head over to my user class and I'll create that method. Okay, run again. And then we can't find Redis. So I'll head over to my test and I'll use Redis facade, run again. Expected, we had nothing, but the actual was supposed to be an array. Okay, so we want to work on our complete lesson method. Now, looks like we actually need to know the particular lesson that we are completing. So into this method, let's pass in the lesson that we have here. Okay, so we're gonna accept that lesson into this method. And what we want to do here is save Redis, and we'll say sadd is the method we want to call. So it's adding to a set, and the set has to be of a particular pattern, right? Remember we said we need the user colon, the user ID. So we're gonna call this ID, and then we need the series ID. So we'll call series colon, and then we'll call lesson, and we'll get the series relationship, and we'll get the ID from there. And the value that we're going to be adding is the lesson ID. Okay, understand? So for us to achieve this key, we need the user's ID, which is one right here. We need the series ID, which is this one, and then we need to put in the lesson ID, which is this key right here. Okay, so we are actually building a unique key so that it would be unique for every user which takes a particular series. Okay, so let's run this test and see what we get. Hope everything does not blow up. Okay, Badcast Redis not found. We just need to import Redis. So use Redis facade. Run that again. Trying to get property of known object, and I think that should be coming because we don't have a relationship for lesson and series. Okay, so we'll head over to our lesson class and we'll create a relationship for that. So return this belongs to the series class. Okay, so let's run that, and we still get a failure. So why don't we do this? We'll head over to our user, and I'm gonna copy the string right here, and I'm gonna use a die dump just to know the result of that string operation right there, just to make sure we're actually saving the correct string to the database, right? So let's run that test. We have user 12, series 13. So we actually are not refreshing our database, which means we're not getting fresh data. So let's use refresh database trait right here. Okay, so this is what I do most of the time. If I don't understand why something is happening, it's just like console.log in JavaScript. You can die dump anywhere in your project to see what's going on at that particular point. Okay, so let's run this, and great, we have a successful test. Okay, so that's how we can actually complete a series, and then later in our project we can get the series or lessons that a particular user has completed by getting this key. Okay, so for now, let's refactor this a little. We have a user. We don't need to create a series right here. We're not using this series variable. What we're going to do is simply place it as such. Okay, because this lesson automatically is going to generate a new series, and we can use that series here. Okay, so this is necessary. Complete the lesson and assert that what the array that the Redis sMembers method returns to us is exactly this. Okay, run that test one more time to make sure we've not broken anything. Great, we're green.